Hi, welcome to Vlad's History, my history channel mainly focusing on topics regarding military history and political conflicts. In this case, I want to tell you a story about how Sweden almost bought Soviet-made tanks, or more precisely, the T-80 tank. You maybe already heard about the T-80 now concerning the current war in Ukraine, because the T-80 model tanks are now being used mainly by the Russian side. And if we now go back in history from 2022, let's say 30 years back to 1992, or even before that in 1982. So the T-80 tank was, during the late Cold War period era, considered to be one of the really, let's say, the best tanks existing in the or used in the Soviet military. And how was this the case that Sweden, which at that time was a more neutral nation in the sense of being outside of the NATO, but also outside of the European community, what later became the European Union, that the Swedish government and the military were at that time thinking about buying the T-80 tank to be used in its armed forces? So the following story is based on a book about Swedish armored and combat vehicles, and everything that I'm gonna tell you here is gonna be more described in the video description. So after watching the video, you can also read my article about the case of the T-80 tank in Sweden. Now here on this photo, you can see the T-80 tank during trials in northern Sweden, what's called Norrland, the northern region of Sweden. And this was done in 1994. So let's say 3 years after the Cold War ended and 3 years after basically the Soviet Union collapsed. And one of the funny things here on this photo is that many in the Swedish military during the Cold War, they believed, if you now speak about, let's say, officers, they believed that the Soviet tanks like the T-72 or the T-80, that they were not able to perform well in like very snowy terrain. So one of the thoughts was that if the Soviet Union attacks Sweden now, or let's say now, because the Soviet Union, according to the war scenario, was going to attack Norway as a NATO nation. So one of the thoughts was that if now Soviet tanks are entering Sweden through Finland and so on, that if it's a winter time, if it's now, let's say, January or February or December, that the Soviet tanks are gonna get basically stuck in the snow, or that they are gonna roll very slowly. And one of the things that at that time the Swedish officers that were testing the tank in this kind of terrain, what they realized is that the T-80 was actually considered to be very maneuverable. It was able to roll very quick, not like completely like fast, but still it was still able to roll in the snowy terrain. So that became like a very, how to say, like a nasty surprise, because in practice this meant that in a case of a scenario where the Soviet Union attacked Sweden and Norway, that the Soviet tanks would be much faster in their advance through snow terrain than many people like in the military in Sweden at that time believed or expected. So in order to understand this story, you have to know that at the end of the Cold War, let's speak now 1991, 1992, the Swedish military was using different types of tanks. Here you can see two of them. On the right, you can see the British-made Centurion tank that in the Swedish military was actually called Tank 101, so Stridsvagn 101. And on the left, you can see what later became known as the S tank, or the S-103, which among military experts at that time was considered to be something of a strange animal, because many military experts, they did not regard the S tank as a tank, but instead described it more as a gun carrier, like a self-propelled gun, because let's say what was considered to be the strange thing with the S tank was that it did not have a turret, meaning that the tank had to swing always in the direction of the target, so to say. So these were, let's say, among the main types of tanks used in the Swedish army at that time. And during this period, so let's say end of 1980s, beginning of 1990s, there were discussion in the military which tank should replace them. So which tank should be used now to modernize the Swedish military, the armed forces. So at the beginning of 90s, the Swedish military made tank trials, so tests with different tanks. So there were actually three tanks that were actually three tanks that were being tested. So one was the German Leopard 2. Second one was the American Abrams, and the third one was the French Leclerc. And all of these tanks are now still operational. All of them are still being used, but in more, let's say, modernized versions. Now the case here was that the Swedish military and the government decided to buy the German tank, so the Leopard. However, this tank was considered to be good for the armored brigades in the Swedish army, so the tank brigades. At the same time, in the military, there were discussions how to acquire a cheaper tank that would be used for the mechanized brigades. So the brigades where the main vehicle was not a tank, but a infantry fighting vehicle or similar. And this is the case where the idea of buying the Soviet-made T-80 came up. Partly because it was considered that this tank should be good enough and, let's say, cheap enough to be used in the Swedish military. And for many in the military at that time, this sounded as something very strange, something very absurd, because the proposal was to buy a tank that was considered to be an enemy tank, that was considered to be a tank that was going to be used against Sweden in the case of war, during the Cold War period. So at that time, the T-80 was, let's say, more or less objectively seen, globally seen at that time, was still one of the best tanks in the world. And it was considered to be better than the predecessor, the T-72. And at that moment, it was considered, beside the T-90 that was later developed, considered to be the best tank in the Soviet military. So what happened later on, if you're now speaking again about the 1990s, was that the Swedish military actually did not acquire any, let's say, Soviet equipment directly from the Soviet Union. But instead, this equipment was taken from the former East Germany, DDR. So what happened now, when the DDR, the East Germany, collapsed as a nation and became reintegrated, let's say, with the old West Germany into Germany, the modern Federal Republic of Germany, was that suddenly the new Germany now had, or its military had a lot of equipment that it didn't need it anymore. So this was like the Soviet equipment, and the new Germany is now like searching for ways to get rid of it, basically, to sell it, to scrap it, and so on. So to make a long story short, at that time, if you now speak about, let's say, early 90s, the Swedish and German governments made an agreement that Sweden would get some of the old Soviet equipment to for a lower price, and as an exchange, Sweden would provide information to Germany and to NATO about the test trials of the equipment, like in the Swedish terrain, especially speaking about mainly about the northern Sweden, Norrland. So here on these photos, you can see on the left side, you can see the former, let's say, East German, the Soviet-made T-72 being tested in northern Sweden, and also the MTLB, the multi-role vehicle. And on the right, you can see that the Swedish Army actually later on decided to, or I mean the Swedish government, to be more precise, decided to buy and adapt the MTLB for the Swedish military. So it got the name PBV 401, meaning Armored Track Vehicle 401, while the Soviet-made BMP-1 vehicle, so now the infantry fighting vehicle number 1 with the 73mm cannon, it got another name, PBV 501. So both of these vehicles were used by the Swedish military, and this was the case after the trials were done in northern Sweden, because mainly the case was that the MTLB was considered to be very suitable for not only for the terrain, but also for the Swedish Armed Forces in general, for the needs of the armed forces. While the PBV 501, or the BMP, was actually only used for I think around 3 years before it was just it ended up in a storage. So the MTLB was used for a much longer period. Now when we speak about the T-80, so one of the conclusions from testing the T-72 was that, okay, the T-72 is functioning quite good in the Swedish terrain, but if we are now gonna get a new tank for our mechanized brigades, why not buy something better on the market? So let's check out the Soviet T-80. So what happened was that a military delegation, mainly consisting of officers, but also of more civilian staff, of civilian experts, was established and sent to Russia to analyze the possibility of buying the T-80 tank at that time. So the Swedish military delegation was spending time in Moscow and also in Omsk in Siberia, because what's interesting here with the city of Omsk is that it's a city that historically was used by the Soviet regime, by the Soviet governments, for military and weapon production. And at that time, when the Swedish military delegation came there in 1993, the case was that just a couple of years before that, I mean during the Soviet Union, Omsk was still considered to be a closed city, meaning that as an ordinary citizen of the Soviet Union, you were simply not able to enter nor exit the city without a special permission, because it was considered to be like a top secret, a little bit like Area 51 in the United States. So the assignment for the Swedish military delegation was to simply to analyze, to check out, to evaluate the T-80 tank itself, but also like the production around it, training, spare parts, reserve materials, and so on. And in general, the military delegation was very satisfied. You can of course read more about it in my text. And one thing I can mention is that the members of the military delegation, they thought at that time that the Russian government, the Russian military, was very open, very transparent. For example, members of the military delegation, they were even allowed to drive the tank by themselves, which was considered to be something strange among the Russian officers, because like it never kind of, they were not familiar with or they were not used to that, like a military delegation from a former, let's say, basically from an enemy nation coming and testing the tank, so to say. So here on the left, you can see a photo that was taken by the Swedish military delegation at that time. And this was done in the area of Kubinka, which is like in, as I understand, in Moscow region. And one of the things that was interesting for delegation was actually the types of ammunition used by the T-80. And one of the, let's say, more, or probably I would say even the most interesting aspect of this shooting test was shooting basically like a tank rocket or a tank missile. So not like an ordinary shell, not a high explosive shell or armor piercing shell, but actually more of a rocket. Because this was something typical for the Soviet tanks, that they were also manufactured in order to shoot with rockets as well. And the Swedish military delegation was very impressed by the ability to hit the target on a very long distance. And on the right, you can also see more in the, let's say, in the upper corner, you can see the T-80 being analyzed in the area of Boden. I think in English we would say maybe Boden. It's a city in northern Sweden, let's say like that, or municipality, where the Swedish military still has a garrison. It's still present. In the middle photo, you can see members of the Swedish military delegation talking to their Russian colleagues at that time, Russian military officers responsible for tank training, so training of tank units. And down below, you can see a photo of T-80 tank. That was actually one of the first photos. It was taken by Swedish military intelligence. So just that you know that despite having very despite Sweden being, let's say, a small nation at that time, with less than 10 million people, the Swedish military intelligence was considered to be one of the most efficient ones in Europe regarding analysis and information gathering about the Soviet Union. So at that time, this photo was taken by members of the Swedish military intelligence, and it was spread directly to NATO member nations. So now what happened after the visit of the Swedish military delegation in Russia was that the T-80 tank was acquired. I mean, a number of them were temporarily, let's say, borrowed by Sweden by making an agreement between the Swedish and Russian governments. So they were mainly tested in the northern Sweden. So here on these photos, you can see some of the screenshots I've taken from another video. You can find it on YouTube. It's also going to be described in the video description from that time. So this is, I think, 1994 mainly. And you can see tests being done with the T-80, mainly regarding terrain, maneuverability, speed, So mainly not about shooting with the tank, but more like how the tank is behaving in this kind of type of terrain. And here on the last slide, you can read some of the results that were concluded during this analysis, during the trials. And one of the things you can see here, the last point, it says the operational reliability of the two tested wagons also proved good and was considered well adapted to Swedish conditions. So in general, what happened was that those officers and civilian staffed experts that were involved in the trials with T-80, they were actually, in general, they were satisfied. They thought that their opinion was that the Swedish military should actually buy the tank at that time. However, what happened was that the Swedish government made another decision. So I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video that the Swedish government decided to buy Leopard or Leopard 2 German-made tank for its armored brigades. But then what happened was the Swedish government also decided to buy an earlier version of the Leopard tank, Leopard 2. So they're like, at that time, like there were two versions of the Leopard tank. There was a Leopard tank 2A4 and 2A5. Now the 2A5 was considered to be better. It partly had better protection, a better turret. And the 2A5 was chosen for the armored brigades, while the 2A4, which was the previous version, was chosen for the mechanized brigades. So this decision led also to the decision to decline military exchange cooperation and with Russia, and I mean buying the T-80 from Russia, or more precisely the T-80U. This is a very interesting story if you now speak about military history in the early post-Cold War Europe, because what was considered here to be kind of absurd and bizarre by many officers in the Swedish military at that time was that there was actually an idea, a proposal of Sweden buying a Soviet-made tank, which actually, the T-80 had a name in the Swedish military in the kind of a more, in the code language, it was called Hotstridsvagn 7, meaning, if I translate it literally, it means the threat tank 7 or the enemy tank 7. So that was the kind of the one of the official names for the T-80 in the Swedish military at that time. So it was considered kind of a bizarre thing that now the Sweden would actually buy a Soviet or Russian-made tank to be used for its armed forces, for its mechanized brigades. All right, so thank you very much for listening, and please subscribe and follow my channel. And for more information about the T-80 in Sweden, you can read my article that is included in the video description. All right, take care. Ciao.